So today I'm talking about the esophagus, stomach, small intestine, and large intestine. If you go to the school where I work, you probably don't need to know the histology of the large intestine, but I'm including it anyway because I know sometimes there are professors that do cover it, and also it just felt wrong not to talk about it when I'm already talking about the first three. So I'm going to go into the specific of all the layers and talk about the specialized features of each. But while we have these all up next to each other, I want to point out some key features that you can use to tell them apart easily. So when you look at the esophagus, it is the only one that has stratified squamous. And it doesn't really matter how low the magnification is. You can tell it's stratified squamous because there will be a darker border at the bottom of the stratified squamous layer. So as soon as you see that dark border, you know it must be the esophagus. The stomach, small intestine, large intestine, they all have ridges. However, you can look at the relative size of the ridges to decide which one you're looking at. The stomach, the ridges are really only the very top. The small intestine, they're more like big fingers. So stomach, think knuckles. Small intestine, think fingers. The large intestine also has some small ridges at the top, but the ridges are even smaller than what you see in the stomach. The mucosal layer overall, you're going to see that it's proportionally smaller than what you see in the stomach. And also typically the large intestine looks more organized and regular than the stomach. So you're going to see the same pattern throughout the digestive tract. From the esophagus to the anus, all of the organs have 4 histological layers. They all have a mucosa, submucosa, muscularis externa, and an outer layer, which will either be adventitia or serosa. So the mucosa has 3 sublayers. It has epithelium, which is either going to be stratified squamous, that's what you find from the mouth through the esophagus, or simple columnar, which is what you see from the stomach all the way to the rectum, and then at the rectum it changes back over to stratified squamous. Just think stratified squamous, you need that to protect you from friction in any part of your digestive tract where there will be rubbing. So your esophagus needs stratified squamous to protect it from food. Your anal canal needs stratified squamous to protect your anal canal from feces. And everything in between is just going to be simple columnar. Now, the epithelium always has to be anchored to something, and that something is the lamina propria. So if you've studied other systems, you'll realize epithelium is always anchored to a lamina propria. And underneath the lamina propria, something that is unique to the digestive tract is a layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosa. So that's why we have to call the muscularis externa to differentiate it from the other muscle layer, which is the muscularis mucosa. The submucosa, I cannot say much about it except it's going to be some type of connective tissue, and depending on who you ask, you're going to get a different answer as to the type of connective tissue, so I'm just going to kind of ignore that, and I just suggest you look at whatever materials have been provided to you if you want to know the type of connective tissue. Now, the muscularis externa throughout the digestive tract has at least 2 layers. The outermost layer, the farthest away from the mucosa, is the longitudinal layer. The inner layer is the circular layer. The stomach, however, has an additional layer which becomes the innermost layer, which is the oblique layer. And everything is going to be connected to surrounding structures either via adventitia or serosa. So organs that are in your peritoneum, they're in that sac that holds your digestive organs, have serosa because the peritoneum is serosa. And this serosa, remember, it is a double-layered membrane that allows for movement because it has that fluid in between the layers which prevents friction. You're going to see adventitia on organs that are typically less mobile. They don't need to be that mobile. So they're either going to be retroperitoneal, meaning behind the peritoneum and anchored to your abdominal wall, or not within the abdominal cavity at all, like the esophagus. So starting with the esophagus, it's easy enough to see that there are 1, 2, 3 distinct layers starting from the top, starting from the open space, the lumen. So those 3 layers all together will make up your mucosa. And remember, we said that the first layer will be the stratified squamous epithelium. The second layer is going to be the lamina propria. And the third, the muscularis mucosa. So you can orient yourself in the esophagus very easily just by counting down. Then you should know beneath the mucosa, once you get beneath those 3 layers, you will find the submucosa. And below the submucosa is your muscularis externa with your inner circular layer and outer longitudinal layer. And then on the very, very outside, because this is the esophagus, we don't find serosa, we have adventitia. And I also want to mention one more thing about the muscularis externa. So in this example, it is entirely smooth muscle, but you will see different types of muscle depending on what part of the esophagus you're looking at. If you're looking at the very superior portion, it is skeletal muscle. In the middle, it's a mix, and the inferior portion is entirely smooth muscle. So once you reach the inferior portion of the esophagus, from then on out, the muscularis externa in the digestive tract will be smooth muscle. So to identify this, I think first look for that stratified squamous and that dark purple border at the bottom, although it doesn't necessarily need to be purple, just see that it is darker than what's above it. And you also will always see a pretty large, obvious muscularis mucosa. And then just some other things to keep in mind. It does have adventitia, not serosa, and the type of muscle is going to vary depending on what part you're looking at. Now, before we look at the actual slide of the stomach, I just wanted you to see a drawing of what you're looking at. So you're not going to see 3 nice layers for the mucosa like you did in the esophagus. This is because in the stomach, the epithelium is not one flat layer. It goes down. It's not just a flat layer. Therefore, the lamina propria is not a flat layer. So the lamina propria is in between these gastric pits and gastric glands. The muscularis mucosa, however, will be a nice flat layer. So if you look for that, that will mark off the bottom of your mucosa. Also, I just want to explain why you have a pit versus a gland. The gastric pit is the opening of the gland, and they gave it a different name because it is just the regular surface epithelium. So the pit is regular surface epithelium. When you get deeper inside, now you have tissue that is actually going to release products like hormones and pepsinogen. So it's actually a gland. So this is the mucosa. Like I said, you don't see epithelium and lamina propria. They're all kind of mixed in together, but you do see the border at the bottom, which is the muscularis mucosa. And below that will be the submucosa and muscularis externa. So these inward parts here, I would call those gastric pits. Those are the openings. And deeper in the layer, any openings in there I would refer to as gastric glands. In the muscularis externa, you do have an oblique layer, but oftentimes I don't really see the oblique layer on slides, so you can't really count on it being there. I would just know that it is the innermost layer. You can clearly see, though, the circular layer and the outer longitudinal. So when you're looking at the stomach, the top is either going to look, like I said, kind of more like knuckles than fingers, which is what you would see in the small intestine. Or, depending on how they cut the slide, it might look kind of like Cheerios, little circles, because those little circles will be the openings at the top of the epithelium. Those will be the gastric pits. Also, just make sure you use that layer of muscularis mucosa to orient yourself. Once you find that, then you know submucosa, muscularis externa. And I'll mention the epithelium is simple columnar, but it is not always clearly identifiable as being simple columnar. Same with the goblet cells. They're there, but they're not generally obvious. You will see obvious goblet cells in a minute when we look at the small intestine. And just remember, like I said, pits towards the top, glands towards the bottom. And because the stomach is a highly mobile organ located within the peritoneum, it does not have adventitia, it has serosa. So in the small intestine, you're going to see big fingers called villi. So the villi are lined with the epithelium, and the inside of the villi is lamina propria. And at the base of the villi, you have parts that go deeper downwards. Those are the intestinal crypts, also called intestinal glands. And then I also want to mention that the edges of the simple columnar cells are going to have microvilli. So those are just little nubs that increase surface area of the cells to make the cells better at absorbing, which is the main function of your small intestine, is to absorb your nutrients. So if we look at this closely, this is part of a villi very close up. You can clearly see the layers of simple columnar on the outside, and the lamina propria is what the epithelium is anchored to on the inside of the villi. You can also see very nicely the microvilli. So sometimes you can actually see the fingers. Sometimes it just looks like it does here, like a dark border. And you can also see the goblet cells. So remember, a goblet is a cup. So any of these cells that have a kind of opening on the top would be goblet cells. And those secrete mucus. So here we're looking at it from much farther back, so you can't clearly see those features, but all of those features would be located up here in the mucosa. You can still see all those finger-like villi. And you can see that nice layer of muscularis mucosa makes the bottom edge of the mucosa layer just like it does in the stomach. So below that is submucosa, and below that, muscularis externa. And this is longitudinal and circular layers. So the small intestine, in this particular example, I know that this is an ileum. So it has serosa. So the rule is the duodenum is kind of anchored tightly with the pancreas. You don't want it to be moving around. So it is retroperitoneal, hanging out with the pancreas. It has adventitia. The other two have serosa. The jejunum and ileum have serosa. And I'll tell you in a minute how I know this is not the duodenum. All right, so remember, you want to look for your finger-like extensions. If you're close enough, you'll see the brush border and the simple columnar. Any of these places where it goes deeper down, I would say it's safe to say those are intestinal crypts. And some of these Cheerios that we're kind of seeing in the bottom there, I think those would also be intestinal crypts of villi that we can't see. And like I said before, duodenum has adventitia because it's retroperitoneal. The jejunum and ileum would have serosa. Now, you can tell this is not the duodenum because if it was, there would be a bunch of glands located in this submucosa, which I will show you when we get to the practice portion of this. And to differentiate ileum from jejunum, you're supposed to, look for Peyer's patches, but I cannot reliably find Peyer's patches, so I can't really explain that to you. But just throwing it out there if you want to investigate that topic further. All right, so now we're at the large intestine. Mucosa with the muscularis mucosa making the bottom edge. Submucosa, muscularis externa with both the layers. Now, just like in the small intestine, whether you have adventitia or serosa is going to depend what part of the large intestine you're looking at. The ascending and descending colon are retroperitoneal and therefore have adventitia. The transverse colon has serosa. And to be honest, I do not recall about the sigmoid colon. I believe that would have adventitia, but I need to fact check myself on that. All right, so what you're going to see here is you don't have villi, but if you were close enough, you might be able to see some microvilli. The goblet cells become more numerous, so if you see just an amazing amount of goblet cells, you're probably looking at a large intestine, although they are not visible from this far away in this particular slide. I would also note the mucosa looks more organized than what you see in the stomach, and it's also proportionally smaller than what you see in the stomach. So, this mucosa layer is about the same size as the submucosa. It's much smaller than the muscularis externa in the stomach or anywhere in the stomach. The mucosa would be larger than the submucosa. All right, so now we are ready for our practice. So I want you to see, can you identify the organ, and also try to identify as many sublayers as you can. I'm going to give you 10 seconds and then I'll just start pointing stuff out. So pause if you would like more time to look at it. So this is the esophagus, which I hope you could very easily recognize that this is many layers of pancake cells with a dark border, so it must be stratified squamous. And if this is the epithelium, that's the lamina propria, and that's the muscularis mucosa. So this is a stomach. This has more ridges than what we saw in the first example I showed you, but we have knuckles on the top here on ridges, and like I said, the mucosa is pretty large compared to the submucosa. So this would be your lamina propria and epithelium all mixed together, some gastric pits, glands down here, muscularis mucosa at the bottom, submucosa, and muscularis externa. So this is a really close-up view of the stomach. This is what I had mentioned before, where sometimes the stomach will appear to have Cheerios at the top. So we're only looking at the mucosa here. We didn't even get to the muscularis mucosa. So these would be the gastric pits. In here would be gastric glands. So as soon as you see these big fingers, you should know it's a small intestine. We cannot tell what part of the small intestine because we can't see the submucosa. Remember, these cells are simple columnar, with goblet cells being specialized types of simple columnar, microvilli on the border. You just see kind of a fuzziness. Lamina propria in the villi, and down here would be part of the muscularis mucosa. So it doesn't matter how far out and terrible this slide is, you still see that darker border at the bottom, which tells you this is stratified squamous and therefore an esophagus. It is a little harder to tell lamina propria and muscularis mucosa apart here. So in that case, if you look at this, that's clearly identifiable as the muscularis externa, which makes this the submucosa, which makes this the muscularis mucosa, and the lamina propria is just too fuzzy to really tell clearly. So this is a small intestine. We can tell because it has fingers. And also, so here, that's our muscularis mucosa, which means down here, that's our submucosa. And you can see there are lots of Cheerios. There's lots of circles in there. Those are those brunners glands I talked about before. So because we're seeing brunners glands, we know this must be the duodenum, because you would not see that in the jejunum or ileum. So if this is the duodenum, what would the outer layer be? Serosa or adventitia? It would be adventitia because remember, duodenum is hanging out with the pancreas behind the peritoneum, not in the peritoneum. And this is a large intestine. You can tell because it doesn't have fingers. The mucosa layer is relatively small compared to the submucosa. And all of those white, bubbly kind of things, those are actually the goblet cells. So there's just a ton of them here, which is another sign you're looking at a large intestine. All right, that's all of the examples I have for you today. I hope this was helpful. Have a great day and have fun learning.